We've all been part of some uncanny coincidences that we're unable to explain, and in most cases they don't really have much of an impact on our lives. But in some instances, coincidences are so unlikely and meaningful that they're spoken about for decades afterward. In 2004, the film The Passion of the Christ, which was co-written, co-produced, and directed by actor Mel Gibson, was released and instantly took the world by storm. But not many people know that an incredible coincidence took place while it was being filmed. The movie focuses mostly on the last 12 hours before Jesus' crucifixion, including his time in the Garden of Gethsemane, the anxiety that his mother Mary went through, the torture that Jesus was forced to endure, and of course his crucifixion. It also briefly touches on his resurrection 3 days later. It's a subtitled film for English speakers, since the actors spoke only reconstructed Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, and it was filmed in its entirety in Italy. In its opening weekend, it earned as much as $83 million, and today it's estimated that 31% of American adults have seen it at least once. While it received positive reviews from a lot of people, others weren't as impressed, since they found it to be controversial. Some viewers thought that the graphic violence in the film was too much to bear, while others felt that it was anti-Semitic. Today, it holds the record for being the highest-grossing independent film of all time. Jim Caviezel played the role of Jesus, and at times, filming took its toll on him. In one scene where the cross is dropped onto his shoulder so that he can carry it, it proved to be too heavy, and it caused his shoulder to dislocate, and the pain on his face is clearly seen in the film, since that shot was left in. Most people felt that he was perfect for the role, not only because of his acting ability, but because he looked a lot like the Jesus we're taught about when we're young. But in reality, many changes were made to his appearance before filming started each day. Makeup was used to raise his hairline, and he also was fitted with a prosthetic nose. In the film, he has brown eyes, but in reality his eyes are blue, and he had to wear contact lenses to achieve this effect. Then, when the scourging scene was being filmed, which is the depiction of the time when Jesus was being whipped, the actor wielding the whip accidentally miscalculated and struck Caviezel twice. The first shot that landed took him by surprise and knocked the wind out of him, but when it happened again shortly after, it hurt him so badly that he pulled his hands out of the shackles that he'd been placed in, and ended up injuring one of his hands. This was also left in for dramatic effect. Before filming started, Gibson stated that there would be no music score in the movie, but he eventually changed his mind, and in the end this was a better option since it was nominated at the 2005 Oscars for Best Original Music Score. While the film would have been even more intense without the music, its inclusion better translated what was happening on the screen to the audience, and in retrospect, many people felt that the film would have felt more like a documentary or behind-the-scenes release had it not been included. One of the film's most famous scenes, which is when Jesus is lying in Mary's arms after he's removed from the cross, was inspired by one of Michelangelo's works, the statue called La Pieta. Many people who saw the film felt inspired by it and converted to Christianity as a result, but they weren't alone, as many of the film's cast and crew did the same. One of these was the actor Luca Lionello, who played the role of Judas and was an atheist when filming began. Some of the cast members were inspired by the film's message after witnessing the hardships that Jesus went through, but according to Gibson, they were left astonished by several strange occurrences that happened on set, which many saw as miracles. He told a media outlet that he saw people being healed of disease that they were struggling with, and even saw people's sight and hearing being restored after years of struggling with these particular issues. On one occasion, a young girl who was born with epilepsy and who suffered up to 50 seizures a day started seeing a marked improvement in her condition during filming. And for more than a month after filming stopped, she didn't have a single seizure. She also reported that she'd been coping with the condition much better ever since. The film remains both popular and controversial today, depending on who you ask. Some people have vowed never to watch it again after seeing it for the first time, while others have never seen it and don't plan to. But in many cases, viewers found the film inspiring, since it gave a far more realistic impression of the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion, and the reality of the suffering that he endured during the days before his life was ended. But for all the good things that came from creating the film, there were also some bad experiences, such as an unbelievable coincidence that took place involving Jim Caviezel and assistant director Jan Michelini. The film's producer, Steve McEvity, recounted a terrifying moment when he thought tragedy had struck. He stated that he was about 100 feet away from Caviezel and Michelini, who were sheltering during a rainstorm under an umbrella when a bolt of lightning crashed down. He happened to be looking over at the pair and was shocked to see that the bolt hit the umbrella. According to him, he saw lightning coming out of both Caviezel's ears, and quite unbelievably, neither of the men were injured. He then realized that the main bolt hit Caviezel on the top of his head, while a secondary fork hit the umbrella, and he was astonished that they were both able to walk away without injury. But quite unbelievably, this wasn't the first lightning strike that happened on the film's set, and in an inexplicable coincidence, Michelini was also involved in the first, which happened a few months earlier. On that occasion, the crew was filming in a remote location, and Michelini was standing on a hilltop holding an umbrella. A lightning bolt hit the top of the umbrella and traveled down into his hands, causing light burns to the tips of his fingers, but remarkably, this was his only injury, which he recovered from quickly. The chances of being struck by lightning twice in a lifetime are about 1 in 9 million, making these two strikes all the more unlikely. And while most people see it as a mere coincidence, others believe there may have been more to it, given the film's subject matter. What you and I may see as mere coincidences, other people may think of as curses, such as the series of inexplicable events that have plagued numerous movies over the decades, many of which are horror films. For example, according to William Castle, the director of the 1968 horror film Rosemary's Baby, the movie was cursed since he lost his life shortly after it was released. He ended up in the hospital while suffering from kidney stones, and while there he had a very unnerving experience. He started experiencing bizarre hallucinations in which the movie's main character approached him while threatening him. He also noted that the film's writer and director, Roman Polanski's wife, Sharon Tate, lost her life in the Manson family massacre the following year, leading him to believe that these two incidents were no coincidences, but the result of a curse. Most of us are familiar with the horror film The Exorcist, even among those who don't care for that genre. But it's also said to be cursed, since most of the film set burned down while filming was going on. The only part that was untouched by the flames was the bedroom containing the character of the possessed girl. Then there's The Omen, which delves into the prophecy of the Antichrist. The film was already controversial when it was released thanks to the religious imagery and events that it contained. But many of the cast and crew that worked on it feel that something was very off about the film and that it may have been cursed. The film's protagonist, played by Gregory Peck, and its writer, David Seltzer, both recounted being on planes that were struck by lightning while the film was being made. But luckily, this didn't have any impact on their flights. In one scene, Peck's character is attacked by a pack of vicious rabid Rottweilers, but he was obviously not the one in that particular scene. Instead, a stuntman took his place, but one of the dogs somehow bit through his protective gear, though he wasn't too badly injured. But things soon got a lot worse and far more serious. A zookeeper who was tasked with taming baboons on set had completed her part in the film, but the next day she was attacked by a lion and tragically lost her life as a result. Lastly, after filming was completed, special effects director John Richardson and Liz Moore, his assistant, got into a car accident in which Richardson lost his life in a very similar fashion to one of the characters in the movie. As for the Stephen King adaptation Maximum Overdrive, one of the actors who starred in the film, Laura Harrington, told a media outlet that she and a few others often felt that someone would lose their life on the set, and they speculated that the movie might be cursed. The set was hit by a hurricane, and not only stuntmen, but camera operators had near-death experiences while performing their respective roles. Extra security had to be present since the set was so dangerous. During filming of the movie Ghost, which most people see as a romantic film rather than a horror movie, was said to be haunted by the spirit of Heather O'Rourke, a child star who appeared in The Poltergeist and who passed away from misdiagnosed intestinal stenosis after the film was completed. People who were present during filming would often report hearing disembodied footsteps and the sound of a child laughing, but they could never find the source. They believe this was O'Rourke, since the film was shot on a soundstage that she had worked on in the past. Jennifer Carpenter, the star of the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, told the media that when she got home from filming at night, a radio in her house would inexplicably turn itself on without explanation, and it was suggested that this was because the film was cursed. People working on the set of the film Insidious would report that they started feeling sick as soon as they arrived for work, and left fine when they left. The Innkeeper's cast experienced doors slamming shut, lights turning on and off, and phantom phone calls. The set of The Possession was plagued by icy winds that followed the crew around, and light bulbs that suddenly exploded for no reason. During filming of The Nun, the director Corin Hardy noticed two men standing in a room while they were filming in a Romanian castle. When the take was over, he turned to ask them something, assuming they were part of the crew, but when he did so, they'd inexplicably vanished. He couldn't explain this, since they could not have left the room without walking past him. But when it comes to strange coincidences during filming, the 1956 movie The Conqueror, which stars John Wayne as Genghis Khan, is said to be one of the most toxic movies ever made, and with good reason. While the film was somewhat of a disappointment at the box office, it's often spoken about because of the tragedies that occurred after it was released. 4 years after it was released, actor Pedro Armendariz started experiencing worrying symptoms such as shortness of breath. He also had pain in his abdomen and hips, and it was then revealed by a doctor that he had kidney cancer. This made little sense to him since he lived a healthy lifestyle and avoided smoking like the plague. He was treated for the condition, but it only got worse, and in June of 1963 he passed away. This came just 5 months after the film's director, Dick Powell, passed away from cancer. And in the years that followed, 91 members of the cast and crew, including Wayne, contracted different types of cancer. It would later come to light that the film's set location, which was the Escalante Desert in Utah, was directly downwind from America's largest nuclear testing site. This was later confirmed by a national security representative, and in all likelihood, the 91 cast and crew members contracted cancer as a result. But the representative assured producer Howard Hughes that their location was safe, and so he never told anyone about it. Many people think the subsequent tragedies were a result of working near a nuclear testing site, but others feel that they're mere coincidences, as unlikely as that may seem. The American band ZZ Top is known for their bluesy riffs while still incorporating elements of rock into their songs. Two of their members, Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill, are known for their very long beards that have become somewhat of a trademark for the band, but were the result of an incredible coincidence. The three members, Gibbons, Hill, and drummer Frank Beard, decided to form the band in Houston when Gibbons teamed up with the other two, who were performing with a band called American Blues. They released their debut album, comically called First Album, in 1970, earning them a large following. This was followed up by another release just a year later called Rio Grande, but it wasn't until 1973 that they became very well known in the industry when they released a single called LaGrange from their album Tres Hombres, and it was an instant hit. They managed to enter the top 20 of the Billboard Singles Chart in 1975 when they released the song Tush from the album Fandango. But in 1983, they soared to fame with the release of the album Eliminator. It sold more than 10 million copies, and people were enthralled by the addition of electronic sounds and the strange music videos that were released for some of the songs. Each album that the band released was met with acclaim, and before long they became a household name the world over. ZZ Top performed live at the 2001 inauguration of President George W. Bush, and throughout their career, they've been lauded for their excellent live performances, resulting in the 2008 DVD release Live from Texas, as well as 2016's Greatest Hits from Around the World. Unfortunately, Hill passed away in 2001, and he was then replaced as bassist by their former guitar tech, Elwood Francis. In 2004, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they continue to make music and perform today. Much of the band's success can be attributed to their commitment to each other. When Hill passed away in 2001, the trio had been performing as ZZ Top for 52 years, the longest period of time that any American band has gone without changing members or breaking up. It also comes as a surprise to many of their fans that Hill and Beard once pretended to be members of a different, non-existent band called The Zombies. The actual band had split up in 1967, but by the time that a few of their songs became popular, they were no longer together. When people started inquiring when the band would be performing live, Hill and Beard teamed up with Mark Ramsey and Sebastian Meter for a short while, pretending to be the Zombies, and played their songs live while earning some extra money. At one point in the band's career, they were forced to take a break while Beard was receiving treatment for his addiction to illegal substances. They'd already seen a lot of success with their 3 albums going gold, but Hill saw this as an opportunity to delve into a different world. He applied for a job at Dallas's DFW airport under the name Joe and was hired. For 3 months, he happily worked at the airport. But when Beard was released from the facility where he was being treated, Hill got back in the saddle and continued making music. Many fans noticed the vocal track for the song Mechanic Mechanic from the album DeGeo sounded very different from their usual style, and it was later revealed that the sound had a very unexpected origin. Gibbons heard about a device called a pitch shifter for the first time while he was watching an episode of The Phil Donahue Show, during which a guest on the show had to have their voice altered so that they couldn't be recognized. He found the sound fascinating and asked the band's engineer, Terry Manning, to contact the show and ask how this was done. He was told that they used a pitch shifter, and Gibbons immediately bought one to create the low-pitched vocal sound that can be heard on the track. When the trio was touring after the release of their 5th album, Tejas, they would enhance their live shows by bringing different animals onto the stage, including buffalo, snakes, and vultures. But on one occasion, one of the buffaloes got a little too feisty, and it rammed one of the cages, releasing several rattlesnakes onto the stage. But luckily, no one was injured. They've also often recounted a very funny story from the band's early days. During one gig in 1970, they were shocked and a little embarrassed when the curtains opened to reveal that just one person was in attendance. They ended up buying the man a soda at the bar as a thanks for showing up. While the band will forever be remembered for their songs and signature sound, even people who aren't fans are familiar with Hill and Gibbons' long beards, a look that they've been sporting since the latter part of the 70s. But few people know how this came to be, and assume that the two merely decided one day that they would grow their beards out as a gimmick. But in reality, it was a result of a coincidence. During one interview, Gibbons revealed that he and Hill were offered $1 million by the Gillette brand in 1985 if they agreed to appear in one of their advertisements. The catch was that they would have to shave off their beards, and quite understandably, they declined the offer. During filming of the 2019 documentary called ZZ Top, That Little Old Band from Texas, Gibbons was asked how he and Hill both came to wear their enormous beards, and he revealed that it had much to do with their laziness. He stated that while Beard was receiving treatment for his illegal substance addiction, the band took a break, and due to laziness, he started growing out his beard. But he then realized that it also worked as a disguise from fans, and so he just never shaved. Unbeknownst to him, Hill had started doing the same thing while working at the airport and found that it was very effective. 2 years passed before the bandmates saw each other again, and when they reunited, Hill and Gibbons found it hilarious that they'd devised the same plan. Ironically, in the years that followed, the band would be approached by fans who recognized them because of their beards, and their disguises had become their trademark features. They also often used to laugh at the fact that their drummer was the only member who didn't have a beard, despite his last name being Beard. Keith Moon and Cass Elliot are both remembered as being legendary musicians who left an indelible mark on the industry. Moon was the drummer for the English rock band The Who, while Elliot, whose real name was Ellen Cohen, was one of the members of the Mamas and Papas, both massive groups in their respective genres. But the two were not only alike in the sense that they were talented musicians, they also shared an eerie coincidence as far as their passing is concerned, and many people feel that there may be more to these events than meets the eye. Moon first started showing an interest in drumming when he was 14 years old. He learned quickly, and before long became very adept at playing, often joined by his friend Gary Evans. But Evans once recalled how Moon lost his then band at a lot of shows. At the time, he was playing in a pop group that would perform on Monday nights at Wembley Town Hall. Moon worked as Evans' drum tech, and he allowed him to play on the kit as a reward for setting them up. But Moon's playing style was far removed from the band's fanbase's tastes, and on some occasions the fans would complain. Moon eventually replaced Evans in that band, and Evans later told a reporter he lost us all our gigs. His first drum kit was a second-hand setup that cost him just $75. He then received a few lessons from Carlo Little, who founded the band Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. He's said to have been influential in Moon's playing style, which is described as power drumming. During recording of The Who's first single, I Can't Explain, which was released in 1965, Moon was almost replaced by a session drummer, brought in by producer Shel Talmy. But Moon told the session drummer to get lost, which he did, and Moon then proceeded to record the track perfectly. Contrary to most drummers, Moon didn't use a hi-hat on his kit until later in his career, and even then he only used it very sparingly, something that most drummers couldn't dream of, since the hi-hat is usually instrumental in keeping the tempo of a song. Instead, he relied on his crash and ride cymbals to fill that role, and this led to his signature sound that he's so well known for today, since they often provide a much smoother and less intrusive sound than the hi-hat does. On one occasion in the 1960s, Moon learned that Miles Davis's drummer, Philly Joe, was in London, and being a fan, he looked him up and asked if he could give him a drumming lesson. But he made the mistake of telling Jones that he made thousands of dollars each week playing in his signature style, prompting Jones to chase him away, adding that he would only tarnish his style if they were to teach him anything new. He was also known to not be very fond of drum solos, which explains why he decided that his solo album, 1975's Two Sides of the Moon, would not be drum-centric. Instead, he provided much of the vocals on the album, and on some songs was backed up by other drummers, such as Ringo Starr. It's also been rumored that an injury to his wrist prevented him from playing as much as he wanted to, and that his use of illegal substances had started affecting his timing while playing, though these theories were never confirmed. Moon passed away on the 7th of September 1978 in London, and his passing is often discussed along with that of Cass Elliot, who was given the nickname Mama Cass, though she did not enjoy being called that. Elliot was born in September of 1941 in Baltimore, Maryland. Her family eventually relocated to Alexandria in Virginia, and in high school she took on the nickname Cass. She added the last name Elliot later as a tribute to one of her friends who had passed away. She became interested in acting and left high school before graduating since she wanted to pursue an acting career in New York. She landed a role in a musical called The Music Man, but did extra work as a cloakroom attendant. She eventually relocated to Washington, D.C., where she met Tim Rose, a banjo player and singer, John Brown. They decided to start a band called the Triumvirate, which eventually became the Big Three. The band then changed members and was renamed the Mugwumps, but it was also short-lived, and Elliot decided to strike out on her own as a solo artist. One day while she was walking along a road on the Virginia Islands, she passed by a nightclub that was being revamped. One of the workers dropped a piece of copper tubing that struck her on the head, and she was knocked to the ground. She was taken to a hospital and treated for a concussion, but quite unbelievably she realized that the accident resulted in her being able to sing 3 notes higher than before. She was on the islands with the band The Journeymen, which would later become the Mamas and Papas. She was the one who suggested the name while they were all watching The Carson Show. A biker on the show stated that they call their women mamas, to which Elliot responded that she wanted to be a mama. They added the Papas to that, and the rest is history. Elliot's vocals are most prominent on the band's songs California Dreaming, Monday Monday, Dream a Little Dream of Me, and Words of Love. The band continued to record and perform until they split up in 1971, after which Elliot embarked on a solo career. She also made several television appearances, most notably The Johnny Cash Show, Hollywood Squares, and The Carol Burnett Show. At one point, she was a guest host on The Tonight Show, and also appeared on that show as a guest a further 13 times. She then delved into the cabaret scene and created a publication called Don't Call Me Mama Anymore, which she performed at nightclubs and casinos in Las Vegas. On the 22nd of April, 1974, she was set to appear on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, when she suddenly passed out. She later explained that it was due to exhaustion, but it's been speculated that her health was suffering due to her weight. While she was performing at the London Palladium, she was staying at an apartment owned by singer Harry Nilsson, who bought it during the 1970s. He chose the location since it was close to Apple Records and nightclubs in the area. But Nilsson was spending a lot of time in America, and while he was out of the country, he would let friends stay over, one of which was Elliot. On the 29th of July, 1974, she'd finished 2 long performances, each of which had several encores, and by the time she got back to the apartment, she was exhausted. She was found deceased in her bed shortly after, and at first it was reported that she'd choked on a ham sandwich, but this was later corrected, since she'd actually passed away from a heart attack at 32 years old. Then, in 1978, Keith Moon was staying at the same apartment, but Nilsson had to be persuaded to let Moon stay, since he was convinced the place had an evil aura about it after Elliot's passing. The Who guitarist, Pete Townsend, convinced Nilsson to let Moon stay over, and even assured him that lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. On the 7th of October, 1978, Moon attended a screening of a preview of the Buddy Holly story, along with Paul McCartney, and when he got back to the apartment, he took medication that was supposed to help him stop drinking alcohol. Unfortunately, he took too much and passed away in the same bed that Elliot had lost her life in, just 4 years earlier. Lightning had indeed struck twice, and Moon was found deceased, also at 32 years old. Freddie Mercury and David Bowie are two names that just about everyone on the planet is familiar with, since they had a massive impact on music during their respective careers, and are both remembered as masters of their craft. Mercury will forever be remembered as the flamboyant frontman for the band Queen, and for his remarkable live performances. His life has been chronicled in several documentaries and films, but there are a few facts about his life that not everyone knows about. He was born in Zanzibar in 1946 and attended school in India, and while there started showing an interest in boxing, but also excelled at tennis and table tennis. He later revealed that he hated rugby and football, or soccer, and that he loved playing field hockey, and surprised himself when he realized that he was a very good boxer. On one occasion when he was in New York, he heard about a disco in Brooklyn that he became very curious about, since people were describing it as edgy. He told his friends that he wanted to go, but they tried to dissuade him, stating that it was dangerous, and joked that if he did end up going, to have a bulletproof car waiting outside. But undeterred, he went anyway, and as soon as he arrived, a fight broke out. The altercation spilled over to his table, and he noticed that tennis star Billie Jean King was becoming frightened, so he grabbed her arm and led her to the dance floor, saving her from possible injury. Not many people know that he was the one who created the band's logo, putting his degree in art and graphic design to good use. He later stated that the design incorporated each band member's star sign: 2 lions, a crab, and 2 fairies, though he added that he didn't believe in astrology. He could never explain why, but he never needed more than 1 or 2 hours of sleep at night. In some instances, he would sleep while on a flight, but wake up 20 minutes later feeling refreshed. On one occasion, Queen was sharing a recording studio with the punk band Sex Pistols, when he and that band's bassist, Sid Vicious, got into an argument. Mercury had invited them to sing on one of their songs, but they declined, saying that it would harm their punk image. Mercury then started calling him Simon Ferocious, which the bassist did not take well, but he reveled in the fact that Vicious could do nothing about it. He also taunted him by asking if the marks on his body were the result of Vicious scratching himself in the mirror. As for David Bowie, he was born a year after Mercury in Brixton, London. When he turned 6, his family relocated to Bromley, where he attended a technical school. Here, he met Peter Frampton, who would later become a noted rock guitarist, and Frampton's father served as the school's art department head. Later on in their careers, the two would often team up to play songs together. Bowie fans most likely noticed that his eyes looked strange, since one of his pupils is bigger than the other. This was the result of an altercation between him and one of his school friends, George Underwood, who ended up punching him during the argument over a girl, resulting in the one pupil being permanently dilated. Underwood would eventually design some of Bowie's album artwork. Not many people know that Bowie could play the saxophone, or that he changed his name to David Bowie to avoid confusion with Monkey Davy Jones, since he was performing under the name Davy Jones early in his career. Most of his fans agree that the worst song he ever recorded was The Laughing Gnome, but in 1990, he asked his fans to vote on which songs he should play on his world tour. The Laughing Gnome took first place, but he refused to perform it. His song Space Odyssey was released in 1969 and then appropriately used by the BBC that same year during the first moon landing. He saw success in the US for the first time in 1975, when he released the single Fame, which featured John Lennon on backing vocals. Another surprising fact that many people don't know about Bowie is the fact that he made an appearance in the show SpongeBob SquarePants, providing the voice for a character called Lord Royal Highness, the Emperor of the Lost City of Atlantis. Both of these performers were by all accounts remarkable men with an abundance of talent. They performed together on the song Under Pressure, but never had a chance to perform together live. But they're the subjects of a strange coincidence that took place much earlier in their lives. At one point, Mercury was working as a second-hand clothes seller at a stall in Kensington Market, along with Queen's future drummer Roger Taylor. Mercury eventually left the stall and started working for Elaine Mayer, a bootmaker. At the time, Bowie was just starting his music career as a folk-style singer who performed in bars and a few clubs. And on one occasion, he was walking around Kensington Market when he came across Mayer's stall, where Mercury was working. Bowie had just released Space Odyssey, but hadn't profited from it yet, and despite loving the boots on display, stated that he couldn't afford them since he was broke. Mayer empathized with him, being a musician himself, and told Mercury to fit him with a pair of boots that he then let him have for free. Little did the two men know that they would one day become two of the most famous musicians of all time. Tommy Lawrence was one of the finest goalkeepers to have ever defended Liverpool's colours in its history. He was a player said to be ahead of his time. It was also Lawrence who was highly appreciated by Bill Shankly. He'd made a total of 390 appearances in the goal for Liverpool, from 1957 to 1971. In those 14 years, he would initiate a new role for goalkeepers. That role allowed him to act as a sweeper, where he rushed from his line to smash the opposition strikers. Lawrence was the keeper who allowed Liverpool to win not one, but 2 league titles, and its first FA Cup back in 1965. Lawrence quickly became Shankly's number 1, and due to his proportions and agility in the goals, he would be christened the Flying Pig. He also earned himself the title of Liverpool Legend. While he was largely successful in the goalmouth, time was catching up with him. The 3-1 Cup Winners' Cup defeat at Munich in November of 1971 marked the last time that he would be involved with the Liverpool football squad. He retired, but it seemed that no one kept up with the goalkeeper's life after that, and pretty soon he fell into obscurity. It was December of 2015 when the legendary goalkeeper went viral following a chance meeting and a strange coincidence. It's known that reporters often take to the streets to interview ordinary citizens about past events or current ones. It's often that they stumble across something truly amazing, interesting, or rare. The probability of stumbling upon a person who took part in the very interview the reporter is asking them about is relatively low. It was just before the Merseyside Derby, an association football match between Everton and Liverpool, that a BBC news reporter named Stuart Flinders had taken to the streets to interview the odd passerby about Liverpool. In particular, Flinders was asking them if they remembered the 1967 Derby when the two teams met in the 5th round of the FA Cup. Upon interviewing one of the passers-by, Flinders was in shock. Coincidentally, he'd chosen a stranger who had, in fact, played in that 1967 Derby. It was none other than Tommy Lawrence. When the interviewer asked him if he remembered the match, Lawrence responded with, "I do. I played in it. I was a goalkeeper for Liverpool." Shortly after this, that coincidental chance meeting went viral and garnered millions of views worldwide. Even though he had a largely successful football career, Lawrence is now best known for this 2015 incident with the BBC reporter. Revered by some and ridiculed by others was the 16th century seer Nostradamus. He was born in France and worked as a physician, and later began his medical practice without a medical degree. In 1957, though, his career path began to change direction. Nostradamus had started writing down some prophecies. He titled his book Centuries, in which he wrote about his predictions of the future in the form of quatrains. They were grouped in hundreds, with each 100 being called a century. It wouldn't be until some time later that he would gain notoriety after some of his predictions came true, although it was subject to debate and interpretation. His predictions tended to be certain events, such as natural disasters and conflict-related events that occurred regularly throughout history. Many individuals believed that his vague poems predicted real-life events, such as the passing of Henry II, the French Revolution, and the rise of Napoleon. But critics believe that one may find similar events that had already occurred during this time. That being said, there's one occurrence that some have pointed out as one of the best examples of Nostradamus' predictions coming true, and this is largely due to his use of the individual's name. Nostradamus' prediction read as follows: "The lost thing is discovered, hidden for many centuries. Pasteur will be celebrated almost as a godlike figure. This is when the moon completes her great cycle, but by other rumors, he shall be dishonored." 256 years after Nostradamus passed away, Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, was born in 1822. He was a French chemist and microbiologist, the founder of medical microbiology. Pasteur, the name present in Nostradamus' prediction, pioneered the study of molecular asymmetry. He also discovered that microorganisms were responsible for fermentation and disease. That discovery would also prove that bacteria didn't appear spontaneously, as widely believed, but instead grew from already thriving organisms through the process of biogenesis. Pasteur originated the process of pasteurization and developed vaccinations against anthrax and rabies. While he didn't propose the germ theory, he did convince much of Europe of its validity. His invention of pasteurization aided in removing bacteria. This aspect of Pasteur's life coincidentally aligns with Nostradamus' prediction. These newly discovered things were the lost things discovered, and Pasteur was indeed celebrated as a godlike figure, even being named the father of microbiology. Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist and industrialist, was born in 1833 to a successful inventor. His father was a manufacturer of munitions who saw a successful period that allowed the family to move to St. Petersburg. It was here that the father sold arms to the Russian army, and where Nobel would acquire his lifelong interests in chemistry, literature, and the arts. Following the failure of the business, he and the family moved back to Stockholm, and they set up a munitions factory. By this time, Nobel was 20 years old and had taken a further interest in munitions, where he would become a complex figure. He was a powerful inventor and industrialist, but he was also a controversial figure, much like Fritz Haber, who played a central role in weaponizing poisonous gases during the First World War. Back in Stockholm, 20-year-old Nobel was interested in making mining explosives, something that was better than black powder or nitroglycerin, a powerful explosive. Nobel sought to stabilize this in order for it to be used safely. This is precisely what he was working towards. So he moved from Stockholm to Paris and then to Germany, where he set up factories and labs, making him a successful inventor of a powerful and disastrous explosive. This explosive ultimately claimed the life of his younger brother, an incident that becomes crucial in this coincidence. Shortly after his brother's passing, Nobel continued his work and he developed a casing for his exploding powder that could be jarred or dropped, allowing the explosion to take place, and he called it dynamite. Dynamite was being used all over the world, supplied by Nobel's Hamburg, San Remo, and Severn production plants. While initially being manufactured for mining purposes, it didn't take long for the inventor to turn his attention to the military, who were in need of explosives and ballistite, which he also invented. Nobel began specifically making these inventions for military use and supplied the armed forces. Ultimately, he was viewed as a traitor by the French, and much like Haber, a warmonger. This description and events that took place in Alfred Nobel's life, including his brother's passing, are what play a role in this strange coincidence. The coincidence was the invention of the Nobel Prize, which all came about due to an unexpected mix-up. Following the passing of his brother, a French newspaper released an obituary for him, but they named the wrong brother. In fact, they had all the details wrong, believing that it was Alfred Nobel himself that succumbed to that blast. That unfortunate obituary stated how Nobel was a merchant of execution, a man who made a fortune by figuring out ways to end more lives faster than ever before. Soon after reading this premature obituary, he became alarmed at leaving such a legacy behind and wished to improve his distressing situation. So right then and there, he rewrote his will, leaving a bulk of his estate to fund 5 prizes: the physics, chemistry, literature, medicine, physiology, and most ironically, the Nobel Peace Prize. Not long after this coincidental mix-up, Nobel passed away, and despite pushback from his family, his wishes prevailed. In 1901, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded, the first being in the physics department to Wilhelm Röntgen, who discovered X-rays. Polio, the life-threatening and crippling disease, plagued the world for millennia, with the first clinical description only appearing in 1789. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the disease became the most feared, with major epidemics taking place frequently. In 1916, a major outbreak in New York City saw 2,000 fatalities, and in 1952, the United States outbreak saw 3,000. Those who survived the illness would face lasting consequences, such as deformed limbs that required the use of leg braces, crutches, or wheelchairs. Some victims needed breathing devices like an iron lung. By the mid-20th century, polio could be found worldwide, either claiming lives or paralyzing over 500,000 people annually. With no cure and the number of outbreaks rising each year, a vaccine was an urgent must-have. In 1949, the first major breakthrough was made when scientists successfully cultivated the polio virus in human tissue. Thomas Weller, John Enders, and Frederick Robbins were behind the operation. It would be their pioneering work that would ultimately pave the way for the development of the polio vaccine, and it also paved the way for an unexpected coincidence. Jonas Edward Salk was born in 1914 in New York City and attended high school for exceptional students. It was clear he was bound to do great things. In 1934, with the polio epidemics still raging on, he received his BS degree and then obtained his MD in 1939 after attending the New York University School of Medicine. While he was in medicine school, Salk was working with a virologist and epidemiologist named Thomas Francis Jr., who'd been conducting studies on viruses that could be eradicated. After obtaining his medical degree, Salk was a fellow in bacteriology, and in 1942, through a National Research Council fellowship, he was able to join Francis. It was here, along with Francis, that Salk would begin to develop vaccines, one of which was against influenza. In 1949, with that first major polio breakthrough made by Enders and his team, Salk and his group could conduct research into the inactivated polio virus that could be turned into a weapon to fight against the epidemic. Salk grew the virus in kidney tissue from monkeys and eradicated the virus with formaldehyde. His tests allowed him to prove that the vaccine, even though it was incapable of producing polio, could form antibodies in monkeys. Then, in 1952, Salk and the team prepared and tested their first vaccine. It was a success. The year after that, more than 100 children and adults were vaccinated, and in 1954, massive field trials were underway. It was in 1952, the year that the first vaccines were rolling out, that the epidemic had intensified. Out of 58,000 cases in the US alone, 3,000 of them would not make it. In 1955, the polio vaccine was released in the US, and cases began to decrease drastically. By 1995, polio was completely eliminated in the entire Western Hemisphere. But while John Salk is credited with being the creator of the polio vaccine, it seemed that another individual was making the same breakthrough, simultaneously and independently from Salk and his team. Across the North Atlantic, all the way in Poland, Dr. Albert B. Sabin was born, and after obtaining his medical degree in 1931, his immediate focus fell on the developments of vaccines. At the time, polio was among the most common and most feared outbreaks, so naturally he turned his attention to the disease. Following the start of the Second World War, he would join the United States Army Epidemiological Board's Virus Committee, where he accepted assignments in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. During this phase, Sabin was developing various vaccinations and has been credited with the sleeping sickness, sandfly fever, and dengue fever vaccines. Once the war was over, Sabin turned his attention back to polio and began his research, along with his associates. The research would lead them to an oral version of the polio vaccine in the 1950s. He and his associates were said to have ingested the virus themselves before experimenting on others. Sabin's development, of course, clashed with Salk, who had announced his inactive polio vaccine in 1955. Salk's vaccine was injected intramuscularly and contained all 3 serotypes of the wild polio virus. That year, it was proclaimed that the battle against the epidemics had been won, until a defective lot of Salk's vaccines rolled out, ultimately causing 192 paralytic polio cases in an event known as the Cutter Incident. Sabin, however, was still refining his creation, using a different approach of oral administration. The process marked the advent of OPV, oral polio vaccine. Independently from one another, Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin had created different versions of the same vaccine in an effort to combat the growing number of fatalities caused by the polio virus. It was a simultaneous and crucial breakthrough for the era. Cross-culture coincidences are becoming more prominent as more discoveries about our ancient world are being made. The term refers to the co-occurrence of either similar events, experiences, concepts, or patterns experienced by the ancient civilizations, even though they're separated by great distances, years, decades, or even centuries. There are several synchronicities across these cultural groups, who seemingly shared the same vision in various aspects of life. One example of this is the recurring winged sun disk symbol that appears in several different cultures. This depiction is one of the oldest surviving symbols that can be found in almost every corner of the world. It finds itself being portrayed in different ways, but its general description remains the same. The winged sun disk looks exactly how it sounds. In the center is a disc-shaped sun, and protruding from either side is a pair of wings. Occasionally, the bird's tail feathers make an appearance at the bottom of the circle. This very symbol can be found in cultures from the Sumerians to the Assyrians, a sign often associated with royalty or power, a concept that was seemingly shared by multiple cultures despite their separation. It protrudes from the ruins of Egypt, the dust of Persia, and even from the stranger archaeological sites such as Anatolia. These 3 areas were in close proximity to one another, and there's evidence to suggest that the Anatolians had contact with both the ancient Egyptians and the Persians. But in Egypt, the sign represents the Egyptian god Horus, while in Persia it's associated with the guardian angel, and Anatolia uses it as a representation of solar power or royalty. These 3 societies use the same concept to describe a similar aspect of their culture, leaving historians wondering if this really is just a coincidence or if they'd seen something strange. Archaeologists further discovered that Mesopotamian Sumerians, as well as Babylonians, used a similar-looking symbol. This time, it was used to represent the god of the sun and divine justice, a concept similar to that of both the Egyptians and the Persians. Hebrew society also used the winged sun disk symbol in a similar way, while Sumerians used it to depict the god of wisdom. The list of cultures that used the winged sun disk seems never-ending. To make things even stranger, the Egyptian depictions often incorporate 2 cobras into the symbol, a concept that was also used by the ancient Chinese to symbolize perfection. Archaeological evidence suggests that the symbol began to appear in the Old Kingdom of Egypt from between 2600 and 2100 BC, and was adopted by Asian societies in 2000. It was also used by the ancient Greeks, where it can be found on the handle of Hermes' staff. During the 8th century, it found its way into the Kingdom of Judah and is still in use today, particularly in the occult, such as tarot cards, where it serves as a symbol of power. Another modern interpretation of the winged sun disk symbol is that it represents the tenets of Zoroastrianism. The concept states that the central figure represents the adherent, while the 3 rows of feathers on each wing represent good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. This interpretation is the closest to the modern-day understanding of the same still-used depiction. Historians today still don't know how the same symbol managed to spread throughout the world, or how it's persisted for more than 4,000 years, making it one of the longest-lasting human-made signs in history. It was 1916, the year of the Easter Rising, when Irish nationalists launched a revolt against British rule. The troops were armed and quickly suppressed the British Army on Easter Monday, marking a pivotal moment in Irish history, ultimately paving the way for the nation's independence. It was on that day, though, that martial law was declared across Ireland, with most of the clashes being confined to Dublin. But it was this rising conflict that would leave a grim coincidence in its wake, and it concerned the married Naylor couple. John and Margaret Naylor were a husband and wife living in Dublin at the time that the First World War broke out. They were already the parents of 3 young children. John was a grocery shop porter in peacetime, who would then join the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which would land him as one of the very unfortunate men who would wind up in the trenches. John was in the trenches in Halluc, northern France, on the 29th of April, just 5 days after the Easter Rising began. It would be that unfortunate day that the Germans would deploy their second gas attack, sending hundreds of soldiers to their early demise. Among them was John Naylor, who was late to escape and lay deceased in the dirt after inhaling those toxic fumes. Meanwhile, back in his native city, almost simultaneously, his wife Margaret would meet her grisly demise too. Just moments earlier that day, as the Easter Rising raged on, Margaret risked the street brutalities to go on a mission to buy bread. As she was crossing Ringsend Drawbridge, a loud bang from a firearm marked the end of her life. Margaret lay fatally wounded on the drawbridge, only to succumb to her wounds at the St. Vincent's Hospital. This marked the first female casualty of Easter week. It's unknown if the homicide was intentional or if she'd been caught in the crossfire. It was also never ascertained which side had fired. But as she lay, succumbing to her wounds, her husband 700 miles away was succumbing to his. John Naylor was buried in an unmarked grave, presumably near the battlefield. The location of his burial remains a mystery. Margaret's grave, coincidentally, was also a mystery. That was until 2012, when a surviving relative, Frankie McNamee, son of Kitty Naylor and grandson of Margaret, managed to locate his grandmother's unmarked grave. Her final resting place was in the British War Cemetery, where a headstone now marks the grave of Margaret Naylor, uniting her with the unfortunate coincidence of her husband's near-simultaneous demise in the trenches. The winged sun disk isn't the only symbol that keeps popping up across distant cultures. Another symbol has made its presence known, and its existence continues to confound archaeologists and historians. The spiral symbol is recognized as an eerie global coincidence. It's the oldest symbol found anywhere in the world. In every region of the globe, this strange petroglyph can be found, and it appears to have been used to relay various meanings. It adorns caves, rocks, and artifacts throughout the areas once inhabited by Neolithic societies. It can be found in China, Peru, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and in Maori and Polynesian societies. At the Dinosaur National Monument of Utah, we find a curious cave painting that depicts various beings, and between them, an out-of-place shape appears. It's the spiral, circled by smaller outward lines. Another spiral drawing can be found in Ivins, also in Utah, along the Anasazi Trail. The spiral pattern appears again in the rock carvings belonging to the ancestral Pueblo people. At the site of Toro Muerto in Checta, in the Nazca region of Peru, the same symbol appears regularly. These petroglyphs serve as a prominent motif in African rock art too, and are often interpreted as representations of growth or evolution. The oldest of these spirals was discovered in Siberia, engraved on a mammoth tusk, and dating back 18,000 years. Examples of the same spiral symbol are plentiful, and initially it doesn't seem shocking. Everyone in various parts of the world can see the sun. Snakes, worms, and other spiral forms were also in abundance. But these distant cultures were separated not only by miles, but by time, and they all seemed to come up with the exact same symbol, representing the same thing. It didn't seem likely, especially considering that the spiral symbols meant different things in different parts of the world. Some historians believe that the cultures may have used it as the sun depiction, others as growth, evolution, space, and the galaxies. They've also suggested that these ancient people may have been using the spiral for more functional purposes, such as a calendar that tracks seasons or solstices. It wasn't only petroglyphs that took on the symbol. Ancient societies also made monuments in the same shape. The existence of these figures is a strange archaeological coincidence, or an indication that the ancients were seeing the same thing through the centuries of their existence. We may never know the reason behind this weird obsession with the eternal spiral. Born in Paris, France, was Léon Desbordes, whose career in the meteorological department of the Administrative Center of National Meteorology in Paris began in 1880. In the early 1880s, he would travel to various areas to study geology and terrestrial magnetism. Desbordes became one of the first pioneers of unmanned instrumented balloons that he sent up into the atmosphere to study their characteristics. After refining his techniques, the scientist would discover some unusual temperature records in 1898. Initially, he thought he made an error with his instruments of self-recording temperature meters and barometric pressure sensors. After having a look at his instruments, Desbordes determined that they were not the issue, and in 1899, he published a report indicating that the temperature above 0.1 millibars in atmospheric pressure stopped declining with altitude and instead remained constant before slowly starting to increase. The data he collected would ultimately declare the existence of what he called the thermal zone. While Desbordes was refining these techniques and collecting all of his data, another scientist all the way in Austria was making the same discovery. Physicist Richard Assmann developed the first ever self-recording hygrometer to measure atmospheric humidity. Independently from Desbordes, Richard would make a series of similar ascents from Berlin, and in 1887, he and a partner would take a more extensive series of upper atmospheric sounding, also using balloons. The details of the physicist's 70 ascent studies were documented and became the first published aeronometric measurements of temperature in multiple locations. After the publication of his discoveries, Richard would then take on a particularly lengthy series of kite soundings between October of 1902 and December of 1903. Here, he observed that atmospheric temperature is more variable at altitudes of 3.5 to 4 miles than at ground level. Simultaneously, Richard Assmann and Léon Desbordes confirmed the existence of the stratosphere, independently of one another. On the 28th of April, 1902, Desbordes announced his discovery to the French Academy of Sciences, claiming to have discovered a new layer of the atmosphere. Days later, on the 1st of May, not knowing that Desbordes had made this publication, Richard Assmann made the same presentation, also to the French Academy of Sciences. It was a coincidence that would lead to both scientists being credited with the discovery of the stratosphere. Serving as another cross-culture coincidence is the simultaneous emergence of theatrics in two very different parts of the world, where two distinct yet completely separated cultures invented and gave rise to the same artistic performance at the same time. Separated by an entire landmass, Western England's London and China's Suzhou saw the creation of similar performing arts and saw two very similar individuals behind them both. During the 16th century, many figures were finding new ways to entertain the masses. They would often land on performance arts, like plays, operas, and similar events. William Shakespeare is among the more notable figures in literature. The playwright catalyzed the spring of Elizabethan theater and prompted a surge in performance arts. It was he who cultivated a more mature and complete theater space, which saw the construction of the Elizabethan Theater building, where playwrights, poets, and opera singers from all over could come and perform in front of hundreds. But out of all of them, Shakespeare was the most famous. Interestingly, across Eurasia and China, similar performance art was growing drastically. It was kungfu, or kun opera, one of the oldest forms of Chinese opera. One of the most famous writers of kun opera was a man named Shanzu Tang, who was born in 1550, 4 years before Shakespeare. But coincidentally, the two would pass away in the same year, 1616. Sharing the same year of demise isn't the only thing that the two had in common. Both of them were incredibly famous in their different performance art traditions. Except those traditions weren't that different. In fact, despite being separated by a great distance, both Elizabethan and kun opera stages shared a similar structure and function. Both settings saw a square stage with ceilings and 2 doors on each side. Those 2 doors were incredibly important for the flow of the drama. It allowed characters in the theater to transition between scenes seamlessly. In the ancient Chinese and London theaters, there were no curtains nor lighting. Adding to the independent similarities, both theaters had several levels. The ground level was reserved for ordinary people who didn't pay much for the upper levels, while the other 2 levels were reserved for nobles. It wasn't just the structure of these separate theaters that were strangely similar, but the way the performances were carried out was also very much alike. For example, men in performance arts were incredibly popular at the time in both of these distant cultures. Interestingly, men would play the part of female characters, often due to social restrictions on women. Performances in Kun opera saw no extra setting objects aside from 2 chairs and a table. These items would often be transformed into doors or beds. Similarly, Elizabethan theater saw no particular stage setting either. Most of the settings were expressed by the words from the characters. Shakespeare's plays would evoke the viewer's imagination rather than set up a whole scene. These are multiple characteristics of Kun opera and Elizabethan theater that are strikingly alike. At first, it would seem as though they were coordinated by the same person, or more than one person, working closely together. But there's absolutely no record to state that the designers, performers, and builders from these cultures had any connections. When thinking of ways to describe the disturbing act of homicide, the term coincidence doesn't often appear. Yet it was this word that was used to describe 2 cases with eerie similarities that took place in 2000. It was the morning of the 12th of October when 48-year-old Mary Lou Morris kissed her husband Jay as she headed off to work. Lou was a bank loan officer, a job that she would never arrive at. In fact, it would be that goodbye kiss that marked the last time anyone would see the woman alive. After failing to show up to work, coworkers, friends, and family began trying to make contact with her. That whole day, her phone went unanswered. As everyone who knew her was growing more and more concerned, 3 miles away from Lou's Houston, Texas home, a smoldering vehicle was discovered by a passerby. It was on the shoulder of a rural road just north of Baytown, and inside it was a body, scorched beyond recognition. The CSI unit was called in and began to search for clues. As Jay was desperately trying to get a hold of his wife, there was a knock at the door. The authorities had come to deliver the grave news. That unidentified individual in the vehicle was Jay's missing wife. The condition of Lou's remains made it incredibly difficult for the police to determine how she was even slain. They also couldn't find any means or motive as to why anyone would do it. Lou had many friends, a largely successful career, and wasn't known to have any enemies. She was described as someone who was just genuinely a good person. The homicide of Mary Lou Morris remains unsolved to this day. Just 3 days after her enigmatic homicide, though, another body would turn up. Again, the remains were discovered in a vehicle that was abruptly stopped on the side of the road. Coincidentally, her name was also Mary Morris, Mary McGinnis Morris, a 39-year-old nurse practitioner who was in charge of various clinics for a large industrial corporation. Just like Lou, McGinnis had a successful career and many friends. And again, police couldn't figure out why anyone would want to end her life. Her sister, Stephanie Lohr, described her as an angel, always happy and always making people laugh. But there was one individual at the time that she wasn't getting along with. According to a friend, it was at this time that McGinnis was having issues with a new employee, a male nurse who she claimed she was afraid of. She believed that this nurse could and would inflict harm on her. Right after alerting her friend to this concern, McGinnis headed to her office to pick up some papers, and here she discovered that her picture frames on her desk had been turned around and an eerie message was left behind. Upon leaving the office, she phoned her husband, Mike, and told him that she was shaken. McGinnis asked Mike if he had a firearm that she could carry around with her for protection. The firearm was placed beneath the driver's seat of McGinnis's car. Weeks later, she headed to the clinic with a friend to administer her flu shot, and that friend, Lori, stated that McGinnis appeared fine, but later that day she received a panicked call from her. She had a creepy encounter with an individual and said that she'd be running across the bridge to turn off her computer and then sign out of the building. 12 minutes later, after her phone call to Lori, McGinnis would make yet another phone call, this time to 911. A recorded conversation would capture the moment that she was attacked. McGinnis was assaulted and fired at. Detectives claimed to have evidence against that male coworker, and he was being thoroughly investigated, but the case of Mary McGinnis Morris also remains unsolved. So we have two homicides that occurred days apart, both victims of the same name, both were found in their vehicles, and both remain unsolved. During the Second World War, two Japanese aircraft carriers experienced events that seemed to coincidentally repeat. The carriers were the Shokaku and Zuikaku, two of the most modern aircraft carriers used by Japan during the war. Shokaku was also the name of the class of carrier the two ships belonged to. If the course of Japan's war had gone differently, they would have been the first in a fleet of modern aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for the Japanese military, their war success was short-lived, and only two Shokaku-class carriers were ever built. As the only examples of their kind, the two ships were twinned together. They engaged in the same missions, and when one was out of action, the other had to sit out as well. Just a few months after the ships were commissioned, they were part of the attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 aircraft carriers attacked the Hawaiian base, bringing the United States into the war in the Pacific. From there, the twinned carriers went south to attack Rabaul, and then into the Indian Ocean, where they engaged with various Royal Navy ships. The first strange twist of fate came in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. This fight between Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands was part of a turning point for the Japanese Navy. Up until that point, they'd gone from success to success, but the Battle of the Coral Sea would not go in their favor. The Battle of Coral Sea was a fight between aircraft carriers. The ships themselves didn't see one another, but launched aircraft to attack from the sky. In that way, the Shokaku helped to sink the USS Lexington, but it also came under attack itself. The Shokaku was hit 3 times, with fires leaping up from the hits. The men on board were able to put out the fires. A rain squall obscured the Zuikaku from view, and after the battle it was relatively unscathed. The Shokaku needed significant repairs though, so both ships returned to port. Due to the repairs, both ships missed the Battle of Midway. Some historians believe their presence could have turned the tides of the battle. Not only were the ships missing, but their aircraft also couldn't take part in the fight. But it's just as possible that being away from the fighting is what saved the 2 Shokaku-class ships. After repairs, the ships were sent out on duty again. History repeated itself in November of 1942. While fighting in the Solomon Islands, the Shokaku suffered significant damage, while the Zuikaku got away unscathed. Both were out of action as the Shokaku went for repairs. The Shokaku's service would come to an end in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The twin aircraft carriers were on their way to the Marianas Islands to try to repulse Allied forces there, but U.S. submarines were waiting for them. The Shokaku was hit by 3 or 4 torpedoes, which caused significant fires and flooding below deck. Within minutes, the ship was sunk, and the crew had to abandon the ship. Once again, the Zuikaku fared better, but not by much. This time it wouldn't avoid attack, and was heavily damaged. Still, it managed to survive, making it the last of the carriers that took part in Pearl Harbor that was left standing. The Zuikaku was sunk in October of 1944, while serving as the flagship of a decoy force. The decoy worked, drawing fire from the ships towards Leyte. During the Battle of Cape Engano, she was hit multiple times, including by a ship named the USS Lexington, named in honor of the one sunk by the Shokaku earlier in the war. To make the coincidences even stranger, Shokaku translates to flying crane, while Zuikaku means lucky crane. For Queen Victoria, the fact that 2 of the most tragic events of her life happened on December 14th seemed to be more than just a simple coincidence. Throughout her life, she developed almost an obsession with the number 14, and in no other month was that date as significant. December 14th became a tragic date in 1861. The Queen's husband, Prince Albert, had been suffering from stomach pains for a while. Albert was often sick and had an apparently lifelong condition that was only made worse by the stress he was constantly under. In the fall of 1861, Albert traveled to Cambridge to talk to his oldest son about rumors of an affair. When he came back, he complained that his condition had worsened. The pain in his stomach had spread to his shoulder, back, and leg, and he was having trouble eating and sleeping. Despite the best medical care available, there was nothing doctors could do. It wasn't even known what was wrong with him. Doctors suspected typhoid fever, a condition that had recently claimed two of his cousins. Modern scholars believe he may have been suffering from Crohn's disease. On December 14th, with Victoria and 5 of their children around him, he passed away. In the diary Victoria had kept since she was 13 years old, she left the date blank and didn't write again until the new year. Exactly 10 years later, it seemed like the date would be a tragic one once again. The Prince of Wales was extremely ill. The culprit was again suspected to be typhoid fever. In the week leading up to the 14th, the prince had been getting worse and worse. Regular updates were sent to the Queen, who became more and more concerned that her oldest son would pass away on the anniversary of his father's passing. The doctors at the prince's bedside also believed that might be the case when he went to sleep that night. His condition was at its worst, and they didn't think he would make it through the night. Thankfully, December 14th turned out to be the lowest point of the prince's condition. He survived the night and gradually recovered from the illness. His sister Alice wouldn't be so lucky 7 years later. Alice was 35 years old and married to the Grand Duke of Hesse and by the Rhine, a state in Germany. She had 7 children. In November of 1878, her oldest daughter fell ill with diphtheria, a bacterial infection known for causing a film on the back of the throat. Within days, almost the entire household had the disease, including Alice's husband. Only one of the children wasn't ill, and she went to stay with her paternal grandmother to protect her. Alice also wasn't sick, but tended to her family members, as she had tended to her sick brother and father years earlier. Sadly, her daughter Marie passed away due to the disease. Alice tried to keep this from the other children, but eventually told them. Her son Ernest became extremely distressed, and Alice kissed him as she tried to comfort him. It's believed that that's when she contracted the disease. It didn't immediately take hold, but by December 13th, Alice was extremely sick. In the early hours of the morning, she passed away. Victoria noticed the disturbing coincidence of the date, which is known as the mausoleum date within the family. The lottery is a game of chance, so any winning combination of numbers is nothing more than a coincidence. But when 110 people won the second place prize in March of 2005, Powerball operators believed this might be something more than a simple coincidence. The lottery numbers were drawn on March 30th, 2005. 6 numbers were drawn at random, with the 6th being the special Powerball number. The first 5 were 22, 28, 32, 33, and 39. Around the United States, there were 111 people who were now just 1 ball away from winning the Powerball jackpot. The final number selected was number 42. Only one person guessed all 6 numbers correctly. It was an extremely unlikely event for that individual, but nothing that the lottery company wasn't expecting. Every few months there is a winner. But what was more surprising was the number of second-place winners. 110 people had selected the correct first 5 numbers, entitling them to between $100,000 and $500,000, depending on whether they'd paid extra for the power play option, which multiplied the winnings by 5. At first, lottery organizers thought this had to be some kind of computer glitch or fraud. There's a 1 in 3 million chance of randomly guessing the correct numbers. While there were a lot of lottery players, it was still almost statistically impossible that so many players had coincidentally guessed this specific sequence. With no evidence of fraud that could be found, the next obvious answer was that the players had all gotten the numbers from the same source. That source was simply randomly guessing the correct numbers. Lottery players would often select lucky numbers based on numbers that were seen in the media. Just earlier that month, hundreds of players had selected the sequence of numbers from the TV show Lost, which was airing its first season. Others had played a combination shown on the soap opera The Young and the Restless. These numbers hadn't been winners, but they had just as much of a chance as any other sequence of being selected. If that had happened, the lottery would have been looking at a similar event to what they're now facing. But on this occasion, no pop culture influence could explain the numbers. It was only when the first people arrived to claim their prizes that the mystery was revealed. Each winner had the same story. They'd received the numbers from a fortune cookie. The slip of paper had come with the message. All the preparations you've done will finally be paying off. Beneath were the numbers, with the final number as 40 instead of 42. Despite the winners all going to different restaurants which sold different brands of cookies, the lottery organizers traced all the cookies back to the same factory. It was Wonton Food, Inc. of Long Island City in New York. The factory produced 4 million fortune cookies a day. According to staff, the lucky numbers were selected in the same way as the lottery. Numbers were pulled from a bowl at random. It was nothing more than chance and coincidence that on this occasion the numbers had lined up, and so many people decided to take the advice. The history books recount many times in the heat of battle, where chance and coincidence have turned the tide from one side to another. One such case was at the Battle of Little Round Top during the American Civil War. More than 160 years ago, the coincidental position of one small company helped to stop a retreat and end one of the biggest regiments in the Confederate ranks. The fight for control of Little Round Top took place during the second day of fighting in the Battle of Gettysburg. The name referred to a hill, the small number of 2 that sat south of Cemetery Hill. Little Round Top may have been smaller, but it had a greater strategic importance. Trees had been cleared from the top of the hill, making it the perfect place to position forces. The Union originally held on to Little Round Top and knew of its importance, but during the confusion of troop movements and fighting, the hill was left undefended. Both sides realized the mistake at roughly the same time, with opposing forces reaching the hill within 10 minutes of one another. 4 Union regiments lined up in the valley between the two hills. On the far left flank was the 20th Maine, led by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Defending the flank was vitally important. All regiments had instructions to send out a company of skirmishers, and Chamberlain sent out Company B, led by Captain Walter Merrill. Merrill was one of Chamberlain's most capable captains, even if he'd only risen to lead his company after the former captain and first lieutenant both resigned. Company B set out further to the left than the rest of the regiment. They planned to meet up with skirmishers from the 16th Michigan Regiment, but at the last moment, the regiment had been moved to the other end of the line. Company B became lost. As the fighting began, they found a stone wall to hide behind, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The 20th Maine was hit hard. Chamberlain tried to stage his troops to give them the best chance of holding firm, moving them further left and swinging around so the line formed a right angle. For the most part, they held their position, but countless rounds of ammunition were used in the fighting. Soldiers had to take bullets from the pockets of their fallen comrades, and Chamberlain knew it would get to a point where they had no ammunition left. Eventually, the call was made to fix bayonets. It was a last desperate attack to try to beat back as many of the Confederate soldiers as possible. Remarkably, the unorthodox tactic worked. Many soldiers surrounded or lost their lives as Chamberlain's troops surged forward, but others made a break to escape. As they had no more ammunition, if they could reposition themselves, they could easily get the upper hand over the 20th Maine. The escaping Confederates aimed for a stone wall to their right. Coincidentally, this was the exact same wall that Company B was hiding behind. Company B still had plenty of ammunition and opened fire on the enemy. There were only about 40 men hiding behind the wall, but it was enough to convince Colonel William Oates of the 15th Alabama that there were 2 entire regiments charging at them from the fields. The confusion forced a final surrender, stopping any counterattack and helping to win the battle. The Axial Age was a period of roughly 600 years, when most of the ideas that shape modern philosophy and religion appeared in separate parts of the world. It might seem like this was a long period of time, but relative to the development of human civilizations, the fact that so many of the big thinkers appeared in such a short period of time is an eerie coincidence. The theory of the Axial Age was first put forward by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers in the 20th century. It refers to a period of time between the 8th and 3rd century BC. The time period encompassed the lives of Confucius, the Buddha, and Plato, among many others. According to Jaspers, it was a turning point in the way people thought about themselves and their place in the world, prompting him to give it the name the Axial Age. When looking closely at the individual thinkers that made up the Axial Age, they may not seem to have a lot in common. Different philosophers might champion materialism, skepticism, or nihilism, or have opposing views on how the world works. According to some people, the connecting theme between all these different thinkers was that they were less concerned about the physical reality and focused more now on spirituality and matters of the soul. Themes of being a good person and a set of universal rules that weren't tied to a specific local ruler seemed to appear in different places. The gods were no longer tied to different physical concepts or geographical areas, but were believed to be more universal. But these weren't necessarily new ideas. What really made the thinkers of this age stand out compared to others is that they produced the ideas that formed the foundation of modern philosophy. Both the basics of what's described as Western and Eastern philosophy were formed during this age. Religions like Hinduism and Judaism date back to before this age, but some have argued that there was a definitive shift during this period. Why the Axial Age happened is unclear. In many places it coincided with the rise of the Iron Age and urbanism. Societies were becoming complex again. Kingdoms were becoming empires that stretched across wider areas and people groups. This might have led to a greater mixing of ideas. The people who produced the ideas, like Plato or Confucius, were less important than the era that they were living in. If they hadn't been alive, someone else would have come up with the same philosophies. But even if this was the case, it was nothing to cause places as far away as Greece and China to go through the same period of change at roughly the same time. In that way, the Axial Age could be considered nothing but a strange coincidence. Throughout history, humans have taken unusual celestial events as signs or omens about the future. Even when the science behind such an event, like a lunar eclipse, was well understood, it was theorized that certain aspects of it could give insight into what the gods were thinking. During the First Crusade, Crusaders and pilgrims looked for every possible sign that their mission was going to be successful. So the fact that a number of strange celestial phenomena could be seen in the sky during the Antioch phase was an important coincidence. One of the main goals of the First Crusade was to recapture cities on the road between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Antioch was one of the most important of these cities. Even before they arrived at Antioch, the Crusaders saw a comet in the sky, which they took to be a good sign. The comet coincidentally appeared just after the armies had captured the city of Heraclea and secured the region of Cappadocia from the Turks. But things took a turn for the worse at Antioch. The large city was well defended and impenetrable. The Crusaders tried to set up a siege, starving out those behind the city walls, but they also barely had enough food to survive. Again, a comet was seen. This time, the tail seemed to form a sword, which was a less positive sign. The Crusaders would likely have seen comets before, but the fact they were appearing above such a momentous scene shook their resolve. The celestial phenomena only seemed even more prophetic when auras began to appear after dark. The dancing lights were uncommon so far from the poles, and historical accounts of the auras describe them as being seen as signs or omens. One scene from Edessa in November of 1097 was described as a frightful and strange omen. Another scene a few months later in Antioch was seen as a fabulous sign. Often, the exact meaning behind these supposed cosmic signs wasn't clear to the soldiers on the ground. It wasn't until years later, when writers retold stories of their experiences, that meanings were assigned to them. The chroniclers would wait until they knew that the heavenly light show coincided with a win or a loss for the Crusaders before deciding whether it was a positive or negative omen. But to those on the ground, it seemed very clear that there was some supernatural force watching over their campaign. More strange celestial phenomena coincided with the campaign, including a meteor shower in June of 1098. By this time, the Crusaders had managed to get into Antioch after the defenders were bribed into opening the doors, but a large Turkish army had arrived just after the Crusaders had entered the city, and now they were the ones under siege. The city had already been cut off from supplies for months by the Crusaders, so there was no food inside. Resolve was low, but the sighting of the meteor around the same time that a priest claimed to have found the Holy Lance of Longinus boosted morale. Not long afterwards, the Crusaders would leave their fortress and ride against the Turkish army, defeating them in battle and finally securing Antioch. In later chronicles, the strange celestial phenomena that coincided with the Antioch sieges were said to be signs of miracles, even if at the time nobody was quite sure what they meant. The periodic table of elements is one of the most famous images in science. The table is more than a simple arrangement of elements. Knowing where an element appears on the table can reveal information about its properties and how it interacts with other chemicals. It also happens to be one of the best examples of simultaneous discovery, with 6 scientists working separately in different parts of the world, all coincidentally coming up with the same ideas at around the same time. Russian scientist Dmitry Mendeleev is a man most often credited with the invention of the periodic table. A common story told about this was that it came to him in a dream. This wasn't exactly true, but according to science historians, the solution to a problem he'd been working on came to him relatively quickly. For years, scientists had been working on calculating the atomic weights of all the known elements. Almost all elements seemed to have a weight that was an exact multiple of the weight of hydrogen. It was a fact that scientists could tell was important, but exactly how was a mystery. At the time, it was thought that the atom couldn't be divided into anything smaller, so the thought that this might relate to subatomic particles didn't occur. Even though they didn't understand it, it was clear that atomic weight was an important factor, and many scientists had tried making arrangements of the elements using that weight. Another important factor, and one much more interesting to chemists, was similarities in how different elements reacted with other substances. About 40 years before Mendeleev came up with the periodic table, another scientist named Wolfgang Dobereiner noticed an interesting relationship between groups of 3 elements. In these groups, the atomic weight of one element would be roughly the average of the atomic weights of the other 2. It would also be an intermediate in the reactivity level of the 3 elements. For example, sodium is less reactive than potassium, but more reactive than lithium, and has a weight that is the average of the 2. These were just a collection of separate triplets at the time, but it was an important building block in the discovery of periodicity and the periodic table. In 1862, the first periodic table was made. The inventor was Émile de Champ-Courtois. He arranged the elements in order of weight and then wrapped them around a cylinder. This formed a spiral where the 17th element in the list appeared directly below the first. Dobereiner's triplets would all appear in a vertical line, highlighting the importance of their relationship. Unfortunately, de Champ-Courtois' work was published, and the publisher didn't include a diagram. It was hard for readers to picture just what the scientist had done. Over the next few years, more scientists independently came up with the same sort of system, but on each occasion, for one reason or another, the idea didn't catch on. It was by chance that Mendeleev was in the right place at the right time. He arranged the elements in a table, very similar to the one seen in most science classrooms today. Elements were arranged in order of weight, with columns showing elements that reacted in a similar way. He even left space for future elements he believed would be discovered. Mendeleev wasn't the first person to make these predictions, but his predictions were the most accurate. Shortly after his table was published, 3 of his predicted elements were discovered. For some, this simultaneous discovery by 6 different scientists was a coincidence, but to others it showed that scientific discovery is a natural evolution. The cause of the Bronze Age collapse is one of history's greatest mysteries. Historians have put forward a variety of explanations for what might have caused the collapse of multiple societies around the Mediterranean region, but it's likely no one answer will ever be determined. But a key part of the collapse may be 2 natural disasters that coincidentally occurred at the same time. The Bronze Age came to a sudden end around 1200 BC. The great powers that ruled the land surrounding the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Some struggled through the collapse in a weakened state, like Egypt. Others were so completely destroyed that it would take thousands of years before the ruins of once great cities were found. The Bronze Age itself had lasted for thousands of years. Over that time, there were many dry periods, so when scholars found evidence of a drought around the time of the collapse, it wasn't immediately clear that this was significant. But more research has indicated this wasn't a normal phenomenon. Instead, scientists have referred to it as a mega drought, lasting for up to 300 years in some parts of the region. A drought for that period of time would have had devastating consequences on the various kingdoms and city-states. Irrigation farming was crucial to keeping people fed, especially with the large numbers of artisans and soldiers who weren't directly producing food for themselves. Any country without a dependable water source like the Nile would have faced famine and disease. Secondary effects would include civil unrest and a disruption to the local economy, as well as migration. The Sea People are a subject that's often brought up in discussions about the Bronze Age collapse. The name referred to a group of people that launched attacks on places like the Hittite and Egyptian Empire, and was actually coined by a 19th century Egyptologist. While descriptions suggest that they were mercenaries or marauders attacking and destroying empires, depictions in ancient Egyptian art show them arriving with women and children. Rather than being a cause of the collapse, many people now believe the Sea People were a symptom. They were simply people fleeing terrible conditions elsewhere in the region. Many scholars today think of the cause of the Bronze Age collapse more like a series of dominoes than one main cause. If this is the case, the drought would definitely have led to multiple dominoes falling. But many researchers point out that there had been droughts in the past. Even though they had devastated regions, they hadn't led to a complete societal collapse. One explanation for why this particular drought caused such destruction was a coincidental series of earthquakes that occurred around the same period. The Eastern Mediterranean is a seismically active area. Earthquakes have been happening here throughout human history, but scientists have found evidence of a series of strong earthquakes that took place throughout the region. These were strong enough to shake cities to the ground. What was worse, they weren't one-off events. Some cities were rebuilt only to be destroyed by a second earthquake years later. The fact that so many strong earthquakes happened over a period of 50 years wasn't itself a coincidence. The main fault lines producing these earthquakes didn't release all the energy at once. It's possible for faults to release energy over months, years, or even decades, and some quakes may have caused others. But what was a strange coincidence was that this happened at the same time as the megadrought, which was ruining the region. Each time an earthquake hit, there were fewer people available to try to help rebuild. There was less need for large public areas or money for grand buildings. Eventually, towns and cities stopped being rebuilt and were forgotten about, along with writing systems like Linear B. The fact that Antonio and Alberto Ascari both lost their lives in a race car wasn't too much of a coincidence. But there were eerie similarities between the two incidents that couldn't simply be explained by their choice of profession. The two Ascaris were father and son. They were racing drivers who drove during an extremely dangerous time for the sport. Many of those who they raced against would not live to see the end of their careers, but both drivers were celebrated as being among the best of their era, making what happened to them even more shocking. Antonio was the older of the two. He rose to fame racing after World War I. He made his racing debut alongside Enzo Ferrari in hill climbs, and the two were side by side through their driving careers. It wasn't long before Antonio graduated to the famous long-distance endurance races that were the pinnacle of the sport at the time. Alongside this, he competed in Grand Prix racing, the precursor to Formula One. Over the course of his career, Antonio claimed 13 race victories in major events, including 4 Grand Prix. It was shortly after his son's 7th birthday that tragedy struck. While competing in the French Grand Prix on July 26, 1925, on lap 23, Antonio's Alfa Romeo went off the track at a high-speed corner. He wouldn't survive the incident. Despite the tragedy, Alberto would follow his father's footsteps into motorsports. He began with motorbike racing, but graduated to compete in cars shortly before the start of World War II. After the war, he was encouraged to get back into the race car and was competing again before the first Formula One championship was organized. Alberto became one of the greats of his era. He competed against Juan Manuel Fangio, and Nino Farina, the first Formula One champion. In 1952, he claimed his first Formula One title, and the following year he became the first person ever to successfully defend the crown. Alberto had taken most of his success in a Ferrari car, but after 1953, Alberto switched to Lancia. Unfortunately, after taking 13 wins with Ferrari, the elusive 14th Grand Prix victory seemed out of reach with the new team. It was while chasing that victory that Alberto got into a spectacular accident in 1955 at the Monaco Grand Prix. He lost control of the car while navigating the narrow circuit. The car drove through sandbags and hay bales that lined the circuit into the harbor. It sank, but Alberto managed to free himself and rise to the surface. He suffered a broken nose and was shaken badly, but was relatively uninjured. On that day, he was the exact same age his father was when he passed away. 4 days later, on July 16th, Alberto visited the Monza circuit, where his team was testing a Ferrari sports car. They were going to drive the car in an endurance race the following weekend. Alberto wanted to get back in a car as soon as possible. He was known as a very superstitious driver. He had a lot of good luck talismans, including the light blue helmet that he always wore. He wasn't supposed to be driving in Monza, so he hadn't brought any of them with him, but he borrowed a white helmet from his teammate and got in the car. He ran off the circuit at high speed and lost his life on the way to the hospital. Both Antonio and Alberto were 36 years old when they lost their lives. Both had coincidentally won 13 major races, and they lost their lives on the 26th day of the month. Friday the 13th is a day when even those who aren't especially superstitious might avoid risky behavior more than usual. Flying especially is out of the question for many people, even though commercial air travel today is safer than driving. Every Friday the 13th, countless flights take place without any problems. But that wasn't the case in October of 1972, when not one but two of the most devastating crashes in aviation history took place. The first and most famous of these two crashes took place on the border between Chile and Argentina, high in the Andes Mountains. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 wasn't supposed to be a Friday the 13th flight. The trip had been organized by the president of the Old Christians Club rugby union team, an amateur rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay. They were supposed to be flying to Santiago, Chile, for a match against an English team. The Uruguayan Air Force plane took off from Montevideo, heading south on October 12th. The plane made it as far as Mendoza in Argentina, but bad weather meant they had to land and wait for conditions to improve. The passengers spent most of Friday the 13th at the airport in Mendoza, waiting for a break in the weather. Finally, in the early afternoon conditions, it had cleared up enough to make for the dangerous trip across the Andes Mountains. They took off at about 2:20 local time. As the flight approached Chile, another plane was taking off on the other side of the world. The Soviet state-owned airline Aeroloft was running a non-scheduled passenger flight from Paris to Moscow. Aeroloft Flight 217 first flew from Paris Orly Airport across Europe to Leningrad. It was a problem-free flight and landed in Leningrad without any issues. From there, it should have been a short journey of a few hours south to Moscow. The plane took off just after 9 p.m. local time, 3 p.m. in Chile. There were 164 passengers on board, along with 10 crew members. Back in Chile, disaster struck. There was significant cloud cover in the Andes, and the pilots of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 were having to use their navigational instruments to determine exactly where they were. At 3:21, the co-pilot sent a radio message to air traffic control in Chile. He believed he'd passed Curacao, a Chilean town that marked the turning point to start heading north again towards the airport. He began his descent, but as the clouds cleared, the pilots were suddenly facing the mountains. They'd made a navigational error and were still in the midst of the Andes. The pilots tried to avoid the crash, but there was no hope. 3 crew members and 9 passengers lost their lives in the accident. More perished in the following hours and days. A search and rescue effort was immediately sent out to find the remaining passengers, but unfortunately the white plane was difficult to see in the snow-covered mountains, and the search was abandoned. But there were survivors. After 72 days of trying to survive at the wreck site, 2 of the survivors climbed over the mountain and into a Chilean valley where they would finally find help. On December 22nd and 23rd, 16 survivors were rescued, bringing an end to an event described as the Miracle of the Andes. But in Russia, there was no miracle. Aeroloft Flight 217 made it most of the way to Moscow, but as they approached the airport, the crew was told to descend from 3,900 feet to 1,300. They did, but for some reason the pilots never leveled off. The plane continued to descend at a rapid pace and crashed into the ground at 390 miles per hour. There were no survivors. The cause of the crash couldn't be determined, but it was believed the pilots were either incapacitated or they'd simply lost control. Coincidentally, exactly a year later, Aeroloft was hit with another disaster. October 13th, 1973 was not a Friday, but it was just as disturbing for the Soviet airline. Aeroloft Flight 964 was flying from Georgia to Moscow when it crashed shortly before it reached the airport. Like in the Andes a year earlier, navigational equipment and a lack of visibility were blamed. There were no survivors. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.